I'd also like to thank real quickly the Office of Vice President for Research and Advance at UNM and the Center for Teaching and Learning, all of whom coordinate. Kate Cunningham from Advance does the posters, et cetera, and coordinate the whole thing. So thanks very much to all of them for that. Our format, if you haven't attended one of these before, these are 7-minute kind of almost elevator speeches, 7-minute talks. And what we'll do is just have discussion questions after each one. So when the speakers complete, if you would like to, if you open your participants list in Zoom, you can raise your hand, and that's probably the easiest way to signal that you'd like to speak. And we'll, we usually take a few questions after each one. So we'll go ahead and get started. Our first speaker today is Benjamin Clark, Associate Professor of Psychology. He's speaking on the origins of our sense of direction. I also want to add that he's the recent recipient of a Research Leadership Award for his extraordinary accomplishments in research, a sample of which he's going to be presenting today. Benjamin, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I'm just going to share my screen here and pull up my PowerPoint. Okay, can everyone see my PowerPoint presentation? Okay, great. So yes, thank you for the invite. And what I want to do here is, with the few minutes that I have, just give you kind of a 10,000-foot view perspective on just one area of research that we've been interested in the lab. And the origins that I'm speaking about in this short talk is really the neurobiological base, so the brain basis of our sense of direction. And so I'm going to start off with kind of the big overarching question. And it's a basic science question that centers around how do we navigate? And in other words, how do we get from one place to another? And a standard explanation for how we navigate and get around in our world tends to center around our ability to use familiar landmarks in the environment. And we can use these cues to set a course to where we want to go. This is one of my favorite examples, and I'm sure everyone here recognizes this one. So one of my favorites, because my first year here, this is one of my spots. So from this landmark, I know exactly which way to proceed to get back to my office across the road. So this is an example of using a familiar cue or landmark in your environment to proceed to get to the next place. You could also imagine using the Sandia Mountains. That's a very salient landmark in our environment. There's one problem. So we don't always have access to these cues to navigate from one place to another. This is obviously an extreme scenario, but you can imagine more realistic circumstances, such as being in an unfamiliar environment or a city, unfamiliar city, or even around your home in the dark. So in those cases, you have to rely on other types of cues, and we often refer to that as relying on something we think of as your sense of direction. And so that leads me into, well, what is our sense of direction? What is the neurobiological basis of it? And so experimental psychologists have been interested in this question for a long time. They've been interested in the behavioral and cognitive and sensory basis of our sense of direction. And so in my lab, we take more of a neuroscience approach to the study of this ability. And we sort of rely on an important historical moment, which was the discovery of something called a head direction cell, which was discovered by Jim Ranck in the 1980s. And it was discovered in a part of the brain that we call the limbic system. It includes a couple brain structures that I'll come back to a little bit later in this talk, called the anterior thalamus and the postsubiculum. And what I want to do first is just to illustrate one of these head direction cells in action. what I'm going to do is show you a video of, it's actually a cartoon video of a rat running around a large circular environment. The rat is actually chasing after randomly scattered food pellets in the environment. So this is just a cartoon image or a cartoon depiction of the activity of a head direction cell that is being recorded while the animal is just performing this random behavior in the environment. And just a little bit about our experimental procedures. I'll just mention it very briefly. But while this animal is running around, I'll show you the video here in a second, but while the animal is navigating this environment, we're monitoring the electrical activity of individual neurons located in the limbic system. We're able to monitor them and store that data and then analyze it at a later time. Okay, so here's the video. Here's the cartoon rat, and you should be able to hear popping noises right there. Now, with each popping noise, that is the individual electrical impulse that is produced by a neuron. And you're also going to see arrows that are depicting the animal's head direction every time one of those neurons emits an electrical impulse. And of course, we're fast forwarding the video here. Okay, so I think you get the picture. There's really two features here that are important to point out. When the rat is running around this environment, you'll notice that this particular cell that we were recording during this session, this cell seems to be activated or engaged when the animal's head is pointed in this particular direction. The summation of all of these arrows is represented in this polar plot, so you can see that the density of the electrical impulses by the cell seems to be in the northwestern direction, roughly. The second feature here is that this cell doesn't really care about particular places in the environment. It just cares that the animal's head is pointed in this general direction. So this feature of directional activity by these neurons, based on the animal's head orientation in the environment, lends itself to the name head direction cell. Okay, so that's where the name is derived from. And we typically represent, just to show you a little bit of what the data the subsequent data looks like. So we often analyze the data in the format of what we call a polar plot. And this is just the firing rate, so the number of those arrows over time. And the one thing that I want to point out is this cell was active in the northwestern direction. Well, if you record enough of these cells, and we have many cells in each region of the limbic system, different cells actually fire in different directions, such that the whole range, the whole 360-degree range appears to be covered by the activity of a large population of cells. So you can actually track the animal's moment-to-moment changes in their head direction just by looking or observing and analyzing that data. You can actually predict the head orientation of the animal without even looking at the animal or observing its behavior over time. Okay, so you have this collection or population of cells located in the limbic system that seem to be modulated by the animal's head direction. And you have populations of these cells distributed throughout the limbic system. So I'm getting the 1-minute warning, which means I need to skip to the next slide very quickly and then finish up here. There's a few features I'll just mention before finishing up. So I already made note of this feature of the head direction cell, of these head direction cells. So different head direction cells can fire in different directions. There's a couple other features that are important. The preferred direction of these cells can be controlled by environmental landmarks, such that if you rotate a cue, a salient cue in the environment, that preferred direction will rotate with it, and including the entire population of cells. The other feature is that if you remove the visual cues from the environment, the head direction cell activity will persist. So it suggests that we not only can control the cell activity is not only controlled by visual cues, but it seems to be controlled and sustained by non-visual sources of sensory information. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to finish there. And I just wanted to make a couple of acknowledgements here, especially graduate students in the lab. And we've had many students over the years participate in our research, including McNair alumni. And many students have actually gone on to continue doing research on spatial orientation in other labs, for example, at Florida State University with a collaborator there. I also just want to mention that we're interested in how this head direction cell activity declines with neurodegenerative diseases such as Alzheimer's disease. And I can answer questions about that, but I think what I'll do is I'll stop there.
Great, thanks very much, Benjamin. Let's see, if you can, see, I can still get my participants list, so I can see hands go up. So while folks are marshaling their questions, I guess one that I had is there any indication that any of this is sort of the head direction in the absence of landmarks is reflecting magnetic field awareness in mammals, or?
Yeah, you know, that's a good question, and in fact, there's no answer to that. There's actually some species of animals that will use that to navigate, that source of information, navigate. And I have a collaborator who's looking at that and the influence on head direction cells, but there's no firm answer that I'm aware of.
Tanya Reynolds has her hand up. Go ahead.
Great.
Oh, hey. Hello.
Hi. Yeah, I was curious. It was a similar question to William's, whether you had any ideas about how they were navigating without any visual cues. That seems pretty remarkable.
Yeah, so it does seem kind of remarkable. There's a specific strategy called path integration, and it's this type of strategy. And it's actually a navigation strategy that is well preserved across species. It's this navigation strategy that relies on what we call internal, or sometimes referred in jargon terms, idiothetic cues. But it's really a type of navigation that relies on our vestibular system. Our vestibular system allows us to keep track of our head orientation in space, and that is happening somewhat independent of visual feedback.
So cool.
Oh, and there's a shout out to Tia Donaldson. Yes, one of my graduate students is a Lobo Bites finalist. Yes.
Any other questions? Okay, well, thank you very much. That's very interesting work. One of the things that I noted in the event we had regarding your award is that you're doing work that's both basic science, but also has an applied component, and it's very I think it's very commendable that you're got sort of both of those channels in your work at the same time. It's quite an achievement. Okay, next we will hear from Lisa Broidy, who's a professor in sociology, whose talk is entitled "Jailed Women's Narrative Strategies for Sustaining a Good Mother Identity." Lisa.
Okay, let me figure out how to share my screen here. I guess this is it. Is that working? Can everyone
Yep,
see it?
that was good.
Okay. Sorry, hold on. I can only see part of it, but I won't worry about that. Okay, so first off, I just want to echo sentiments that have already been expressed. Thanking everyone for being here. I know, so I'm going to reset my clock. I know it's a big ask to have you get back on Zoom at the end of your day, so I do appreciate that. I also wanted to recognize Ellis Segrist, who's a grad student in sociology, who's been working on this project with me. And I'm just going to jump right in because 7 minutes I realize go really fast, and I have cut out about 3/4 of this presentation and trying to hone it down to 7 minutes. But just really briefly in the way of context, one of the things we know is that women for the last 2 decades or so have been the fastest growing criminal justice population. And that has a number of implications, but one of the big ones is that among the women who are being caught up in the criminal justice system, a substantial proportion of them are mothers. Some estimates put that up to 80%. So there's a growing literature that's interrogating the consequences of this kind of mass incarceration of women on mothers and their children. And so this project kind of sits within that literature and hopefully contributes something useful to that literature. There are a couple of motivating questions for this particular part of the project. In the first one, we asked, how do jailed mothers talk about motherhood in the context of all kinds of challenges to their maternal commitment and fitness? They really don't fit our expectations of what a good mother looks like. And so how do they talk about that? And the second one is, what strategies do these mothers use to maintain their identities as good mothers, if any, despite these challenges, right? So the data for this study come out of interviews that I did for a pilot project, and the bigger project I can talk about if people have questions, but the pilot project, I interviewed 23 mothers in 2 jails in New Mexico. One was a jail in one of New Mexico's least populous counties, and one was a jail in one of New Mexico's most populous counties. And I did loosely structured interviews with these women where I focused primarily on their motherhood experiences and their relationships with their children, among other things. So a couple of things jump out when we interrogated these data. And one of the things that was just overt in these data is that the motherhood experience for these women involves a lot of regrets. Every single one of the moms I talked to lamented not being the mother that they think their kids deserve. So they said things like, I really haven't been a great role model. You know, I messed up and I can't take it back and I feel guilty. One of them talked about how unfair it is that her young children are paying for her mistakes. Not working for some reason. Hold on. So one of the poignant examples of this comes from a 24-year-old Latina mother. She had 2 young girls, aged 2 and 3, all kinds of struggles with heroin and homelessness and unstable relationships. And she willingly gave custody of her daughters to her parents or her when she had her second child, because she was worried that the state was going to take her children away from her because she was using while she was pregnant. And she said, you know, I had to suck it up, soldier up like you've done with everything else and be a mom, because out of everything, you're doing exactly what these kids don't need, which is being an absent parent. And she talked more about this. And later in the interview, she really lamented the fact that her children are really hurting. And she said that her oldest, who's only 3, is going to counseling not just twice, but 4 times a week now. And that hurts. When I found out she was doing double the amount, I was hurt. I felt so bad and guilty and shameful. And so for all these moms, they're navigating all these regrets, and they overlap with all kinds of issues that they're struggling with: custody issues, physical and emotional distance from their kids, the impact of their mistakes on their kids being disappointed in them, their sense that they're reenacting the mistakes that they experienced in their childhood and the traumas that they experienced, a lot of them from their own mothers. And so the interesting thing that came out in these interviews on top of these regrets is that despite all of this, these mothers cling very strongly to the good mother identity. And so all of these moms, in one way or another, actively reject being characterized as bad moms. And they engage in 3 key narrative strategies that we identified to kind of craft this good mother identity despite their mistakes and regrets. I'm going to introduce 2 briefly and then talk a little bit more about the third. So one is nostalgia. They have all kinds of memories that they talked about of happy times with their kids and being good moms, and that motherhood came naturally to them, and that when they're clean and sober, they're really good moms, and how excited they were about becoming moms. And they also have aspirational strategies and narratives where they talk about being a better mom in the future and changing for their kids. And so those are pretty universal themes across these mothers. The most interesting strategy for crafting this kind of good mother identity is around protection. And this one's interesting because it was the most active reframing of the bad mother label. And in this strategy, they really focused on doing everything they could to meet the emotional and material needs of their kids, often in ways that kind of put them at greater risk. So they talked about quitting alcohol and drugs to protect their kids, especially when they were pregnant or early on in motherhood. They talked about how hard it was for them to give up custody of their kids, but they saw it as in the protective interest of their children. Oftentimes they were really worried about losing their children to the state, and so would willingly give custody to family members. They also talked about this tension between hiding their addiction and jail time from their kids to protect them from it, or being honest with their kids to teach them, not to make the same mistakes. And that was definitely a tension, and the women navigated it in different ways. They also talked about it being their job to protect their kids, and a lot of them were worried about what was happening to their kids when they were in jail and they couldn't protect them. And here's another kind of poignant example. This is a 27-year-old Latina mom. She had 2 boys who were aged 9 and 11. They were raised primarily by their grandmother because she was in and out of the system starting at age 11. And she gave custody of her kids to her mom when they were 1 and 3. So she has not had custody for a long time. And she talks about protecting her kids from abusive partners. She talks about kind of making sure her kids were safe when she was off doing things that she knew were unhealthy for them. And she talked here at the end about food stamps and how she gave all her food stamps to her mom and kids, even though they get their own. I gave it all to my mom because no matter what I do or whatever, I give back to my mom. My mom is the one who's helping me. No matter what, I won't stop giving to my mom and kids. So if I'm out here on the street with nothing, I'd rather be out here on the street with nothing, and my kids and my mom have everything. So just to wrap it up, I know I'm out of time. I can't see you guys, so Bill's probably giving me a time warning. But these mothers are clearly and admittedly navigating contexts that challenge their maternal commitment and fitness. And they know that. They are not naive about that. But at the same time, all of them claim motherhood as a central identity. They all identify as good mothers in one way or another. And despite their failings, they talk about memories of better times, a future where they can do right by their kids, and their commitment to their children's physical and safety and emotional security. And there are a number of practical and policy implications of this. A couple that I'll highlight. One is that the literature has situated motherhood as a really important hook for change for women in the system and substance abusing women. And this kind of frames that as something that they really identify with strongly. But they are navigating a number of challenges. And so it's really important to think about how we can address the emotional and material stressors that complicate their ability to be the moms that they want to be, and how to help address these stressors so they can turn their lives around, not just for themselves, but also for their kids.
Great. Thanks very much, Lisa.
Yeah.
Very interesting. Let me see if I can see the participants list and look for hands. Tanya again. Go ahead.
Cool talk, Lisa. It was really fascinating. I was curious whether there are any data that parents, through having these very meaningful narratives, if it helps their rates of recidivism or likelihood of having good behavior while they're incarcerated.
So that's a really complicated question. There's definitely a lot of evidence that motherhood is important to women in the system, and substance abusing women and homeless women, women who are navigating all kinds of stressors. It's not clear whether that's enough, right? Wanting to be a good mom is enough. Certainly all of these women want to be good moms and are struggling. And so, you know, one of the other things that they talked about a lot was all the things that they need to be in place to be the mom they want to be, that they need shelter, they need treatment, they need, you know, jobs, they need economic security. And without all those things, you know, all of these aspirations don't really necessarily amount to change because they just don't have the resources they think they need to change. And they talk about kind of lack of resources in the system and their struggles getting the resources they need. So yeah, it's complicated. I don't unfortunately think it's enough. I think it gives us recognition that there is something they can grab onto, but they need material resources.
Right, right.
So there was a question in the chat from Mary Jo asking whether having children visit moms in jail had a positive impact.
Yeah, so there's bigger literature on that, and there's definitely some evidence that visitation in the criminal justice system is productive and socially supportive, obviously, but also facilitates desistance and facilitates kind of family reentry dynamics. For these particular women, like I said, they really struggled with that, whether it was healthy for their children to see them while they were in jail, whether it was emotionally healthy for them to see their children while they were in jail. Some really craved that and invited it, and others really eschewed it and did not want to see their kids while they were in jail. Granted, jail stays are short, so a lot of them felt like, I'd rather wait, you know, I'll be out in 2 weeks or a month, and, you know, my kids are better off not seeing me in here. So it's different than prison, where, you know, they're there for long periods of time.
Great, thanks. And there was one more question from Trifinia Peel Edie. Basically, sort of what was the benchmark that these women used to define goodness? In other words, who or what images were they referencing?
Yeah, so that's a really interesting question. I cut out 2 slides about that, actually. So there's a significant literature that focuses on how we as a culture characterize good mothers and the language of intensive mothering, and what we expect of good mothers is, you know, kind of a lot of time and energy focused on their kids at their own expense. And there's some interesting literature that suggests that realistically, very few mothers measure up to our cultural expectations of the ideal mother. And that different women kind of navigate that in different ways. So there's interesting literature on working mothers and how they kind of craft their identities as good mothers despite not being kind of full-time mothers, which is part of that intensive mothering narrative that we as a culture kind of subscribe to. There's also some interesting literature on kind of mommy bloggers and how they kind of try to actively fight against these intensive mothering messages that we as a culture kind of distribute and expect. It's more complicated for these women, right? Because they are not just kind of not ideal mothers, but they are actively characterized in many circles as bad mothers. So it's a little more complicated for them.
Okay, well, thanks very much, Lisa. That was very interesting. It's very moving to hear about these women's experiences. Let's see, our next presentation will be by Tom Turner, professor of biology. His talk's entitled Night and Day at the Museum 4, Grad Students Achieve. So Tom, take it away.
All right, thanks so much, Bill, and thanks everybody for showing up. I think a shout out is appropriate to Mary Jo Daniel, who came up with the title here. I think she's got a future as a Hollywood producer, perhaps, but Anyway, I wanted to share with you a new program that we've just started in the at UNM, primarily in the College of Arts and Sciences and in Graduate Studies. This is the Museum Research Traineeship Program, and our webpage is just up and running. But it is a graduate training program that's funded by the National Science Foundation through the National Science Foundation Research Traineeship Program. And what that does is provides money to support graduate students almost exclusively. So pays a fellowship for graduate students to come and join the program. There's also some money for curriculum development. And then there's money for recruiting, mentoring, and evaluation. And a big part of the program is to understand essentially how objects in museums can be used in scientific inquiry and other kinds of inquiry to understand major processes that have affected both human, natural, and physical systems in the past, and how we might be able to make predictions about the future by unlocking some of the secrets that are contained within these objects. So that's what this program is about. A big part of this is a sales pitch to you. If you're interested in participating as a faculty mentor or a student in this program, we really want to talk to you. And let's see. So the intellectual driver of what this program is about is really to use just about everything we can to interpret objects that are held in science museums, specifically at UNM. And this is just a little example that from a research area from my own heart. This is a sample of fish. So these arrows are not referring to this guy that's holding the fish jar, but rather the fish in this jar, which are trout that were collected in New Mexico. And what this is depicting is that we can get some primary understanding about these specimens through some of the traditional ways that we do that. But, we can employ material science and other kinds of data science and other kinds of approaches to get some things about this specimen that we would have never been able to understand previously. And in this case, what I'm showing is that you can use different tissues and different ways to extract molecules and things from this to get some indication about isotopic composition, which informs a number of things about the biology and the ecosystem in which these specimens lived, the geological processes that underlie some of the processes that we're talking about. So this is just a set of examples of things we can learn about the specimen by incorporating these material science approaches. And then we can integrate that with other types of data, particularly paleoclimate data or other types of data sets to learn about how changes in land use, pollutants, policies, and other kinds of things have affected over time changes in the way these fish or these specimens have interact with their environment. So this is what we in the literature now, it's starting to get a lot of play that we can take these collections of items and objects that are contained in museums and learn tremendous things about them. And this is in a sort of an extended object concept. So the object itself, and then we extend the object by understanding through these science-based approaches, fundamental things about the specimen and how it fits into its environment. The idea here was we have these wonderful collections at UNM, these science museums that span archaeology, natural history, paleobiology, minerals, meteorites. All these objects contain information that can be pulled together across museums. And so the big idea that we put forward in this proposal was to integrate across these museums and collections on problems that we might focus on. And some of these problems surround the grand challenges. So water is a big one, and how availability of water and climate change affect people, affect resources in the environment, affect physical environments, and how those things interact with each other. So it's really a way that we can understand these coupled systems through coupling the objects contained in these museums. The idea here is to employ a material science approach, as I showed you with the isotopes, but also data science, because we as curators in these museums, we keep data sets that are compiled and aggregated at the national and international level and can be used and integrated with other types of data, climatological data and so on, to ask important questions. And where the graduate students come in is really to form collaborative teams across these museums and across disciplinary departments to address these kinds of questions. We're highlighting in this research the Southwestern US, both as part of the place-based research and because we think we can really engage graduate students, particularly from communities that are underrepresented traditionally in STEM, in these lines of inquiry. So this is one of the big goals of the program. Our partners in the program are the Maxwell Museum of Anthropology, and you know the public face of this, but there's a whole back part that has collections of anthropological materials, archaeological materials, where high profile analyses on ceramics and other things are done. The Museum of Southwestern Biology holds millions of specimens of biological materials and organisms collected over the last 100 years, which really spans some of the most important changes that have occurred in terms of environments, especially in the Anthropocene, which we're living in now, where humans have had a large impact on the environment. And then the paleobiology collections that are held on Earth and planetary sciences that go back many, many years, millions of years, to look at life prior to humans, but to really look at the interactions between geological processes and living processes, to draw a deeper historical context into some of the scientific questions that we're addressing. We're housing this project in the PAIS Interdisciplinary Sciences Cooperative. And this is an area that hosts 6 centers on campus that are focused on data science, material science, and also have collaborative space to bring our students together to really connect them to the scientists that are doing the basic research that can be connected to the museum and object-based research. And that's a really big goal of the program. So we really want to, our major goals and what we hope the outcomes of this program will be is that we're going to really support interdisciplinary graduate research and education at UNM by drawing together a lot of the historical strengths that we have at UNM through our collections, through the people that are there, and through the faculty that are doing just outstanding research that's based on these collections. Another idea is to draw faculty in that wouldn't normally think about using objects in their research and to think about innovative ways that we can use that. We are really serious about increasing diversity in STEM. And we feel that this program is not necessarily to train museum people, but rather to train scientists who are aware of museums and the kinds of resources that they provide for research, and allow and hopefully to propel our students and trainees to the highest levels of careers that they can go into in natural resources and other type of things. And then we're very interested in the innovation part of this, to develop new ways to harness new technologies in understanding these objects and interpreting these objects in the context of these problems that we're looking at. We are very interested in engaging faculty across the university in this endeavor. And we will consider students and supporting students from any disciplinary area in this program, with the proviso that these students would be interested in developing the kinds of object-based approaches that we're taking, and then linking those to broader concepts. So we need you as faculty members, as faculty mentors, to get engaged with the museum community and to hopefully do that through this program. So that's my pitch. You saw the webpage, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Great, thanks very much, Tom. What questions do folks have?
Tom, I have a question for you. What areas are students currently in the program that have shown interest? And are you working with the university libraries as well?
Yeah, you know, so we definitely are working with university libraries. Carl Benedict has been a real resource for us. This really comes from a lot of research that has been done, that's been a museum-focused research for many years at UNM. And I'll give you an example of one that really just recently just knocked my socks off. We have a student in anthropology that studies fish bones from middens, from Puebloan middens, and has these bones. And he was interested in uncovering how people were using the bones. So he used isotope approaches to look at this and then put it in the context of modern day ecosystems, and showed some remarkable changes in resource use of Puebloan people as climates changed over sort of the last several hundred to 1,000 years. Things got drier, things got cooler and wetter, and fish were used more in a cooler and wetter climate. But what was really amazing is that the fish bones told us that the ecosystem, 500 years ago functioned very differently. The Rio Grande ecosystem functioned very differently than it functions now, because we were able to integrate those data with ongoing studies on contemporary ecosystems in the Rio Grande. And so this connection was just remarkable in its ability to sort of both reveal something about human communities and what they did in response to resource changes, and what natural communities did. So, that's just one example. We've had students from geography and environmental studies that are interested in plotting species distribution data and how that relates to changing climates, especially paleoclimates. So it's really the thing that the museum offers is that longer time view, and typically in a scientific study, we're limited to 3 to 5 years in our thinking. But this really gives us a way to look very deeply in time at questions that we may be able to, that only long-term kind of viewpoints might be able to reveal the answers to. So that's sort of the, where the students fit in. And this is why, we're very excited about the way this program might evolve, because we never know what kind of students might be interested in using these type of materials for these types of questions.
Tom, I had a question about process, and that is sort of how do you help people in fields that maybe don't customarily use those collections become aware of what's there and how they might be used analytically in a different field? Like, what's the process for kind of brainstorming and just making people aware of what's possible?
Well, one thing you do, Bill, is get on a lightning talk, right? You start talking about it. But the other thing you do, I'll give you a great example. So in our Center for Stable Isotopes, which is sort of a center that evolved out of Earth and Planetary Sciences, it became clear that there was a great connection to museums. And it just turned out that the students identified that. I had a few students that said, hey, what are isotopes about? Let's figure this out. And they started going to these, to a colloquium that's put on by CSI. And it just sort of transformed the way they kind of viewed the materials that they had. So it's really these, I think serendipity plays a big role, but it's also sort of a curated serendipity, right? You want, for people that are doing these kinds of things, you want to try to communicate that as broadly as you can. And I think that's one of the big challenges of interdisciplinary research broadly, is that it's how to figure out how to break these silos down and how to get people talking. And that's really one of the things we're hoping to do in this program through colloquia, professional workshops, and other types of activities in the program.
Great, thanks very much. Let's see, let's hear from our next speaker, Amaris Ketcham, Associate Professor in the Honors College, whose talk is entitled Self-Annihilation and Discovery Through Collage. Amaris.
Hi, everybody. I'm Amaris Ketcham, and I just want to say I'm really thrilled to be here and to be talking with you all. I'm glad I'm ending and not like sandwiched in the middle of several scientific research heavy projects. But so I'm here today to talk about a book of poems that I've recently written and is now hot off the press, actual 3D. Yeah, hot off the press. It's called Glitches in the FBI, And it's a collection of found poetry that uses dialogue from the X-Files as its source material. Found poetry, for those of you who don't know, is a kind of literary collage where words and phrases are taken from an original source and placed in a new context to be read as poetry. This reframing of the original material has a long history and was often employed by Dadaists and Surrealists as ways to challenge our concept of authorship, to spark creativity, or to revise drafts of work in progress. I've read that writing found poetry is a form of self-annihilation, and that's part of my talk today, for an author. So through collage, the author, the artist can kind of disappear behind the work as the content begins to take center stage. Chance and surprise dominate the process rather than the steady gaze of self-reflection or the complexities of research. And using the X-Files television show as my inspiration, I sought to retain a mood of mystery and a sense of the sort of spooky speculation that goes on throughout the show, but without any direct references to the television show itself, because I wanted people who were unfamiliar with the show to also have the chance to enjoy the book. As far as authorship goes too, in an effort not to plagiarize, right? Which that's always one of the questions that comes up when you talk about collage. I never took more than usually about or fewer than 3 words in a row from the original material as a way to make it into something entirely new. There are aliens, of course, but they're mixed in with a variety of folk beliefs. UFOs, men in black, and abductions all make appearances, but as do foxes, hummingbirds, elk hounds, childhood memories, grief, and longing for a better future. These poems sometimes did surprise me, having their own things to say, seemingly without the intervention of the author. And that, I think, is part of the evidence of self-annihilation. In many ways, in the poems, the characters have emerged with their own thoughts and monologues. And so the speaker of the poem becomes very distinct from the author of the poem. I typically write essays and research-heavy poems. If any of you all have seen the Poetic Inventory of the Sandia Mountains, my previous book, that was all based in research of flora and fauna in the Sandia Mountains. So in these, there aren't really characters. So it's interesting that through collage, a kind of more of a fictional approach emerged in my own creative process. So first, I'd like to share a couple poems that show this sort of sense of self-annihilation. So you can see how the author and the character are very distinct from one another. So the first poem is "Only a Cat Can Worry Ancestral Rats," and it's repurposed dialogue from season 3, episode 6 of the X-Files. Mona knows the superstitions of old systems, the nature and depth of bureaucracy. She's feeling squirrely of late about these artifacts and their mythologies. History handcuffs us, she says, projects security while claiming our spirits. Foreign letters should be buried in urns, along with free advice. So far underground, 1,000 years of tunnels won't excavate them. Wild their whereabouts and overflow them with curses, Mona. If you save the bones intact, it'll just doctor itself, summon determination and crawl through the sewer with ceremony. So let's hold in us a jaguar spirit. Give it some room for a personal jungle, ready to take 1,000 small bites. Yeah, so the next poem I would like to share is another example of a character, and in particular, this one is more of a dramatic monologue that sort of came out of the work. So this one is Schoolboy's New Age Ideas, and it's repurposed dialogue from season 2, episode 10. Hey, little brother. Hey, butt crumb. Don't get the creeps when I talk about soul transference and the age of Aquarius. It's just this pepperoni pizza is a blessing of the dawning of a new age when we can be holy, delivered from this monument to barbarism. Piss off all those piss off all those keepers of scorecards. That dog-eat-dog spite will stick out like a sore thumb. What's this? You're just getting motion sickness from enlightenment. Like, don't have a dairy cow, mankind. I'm not ribbing you. I wouldn't Nixon you. Tainted pastures beget tainted pastures. Give it some earth years and this wall makes sense. Kind of like we're animal spirits kept as pets and bearing witness to a standstill between home and the magic of morning light. And then now I'd like to transition to the idea of self-discovery through collage. So sometimes through collage, there's a way also not just to kind of tap into the creativity and what happens when chance emerges as the driving feature of the process, but there are ways to understand that you're thinking about certain things and that these need to be expressed as well, such as perhaps maybe the grief that many of us are wrestling with in isolation. So this is one that was written squarely during the pandemic, about a more personal experience. But again, all the words come directly from the X-Files episode itself. So this is Witness, repurposed dialogue from season 1, episode 15. When he died, I thought I saw a fox slipping through the field, lone and clever. He ran in the country like a ghost, daring me to blink. Blink and the haiku's over. Blink and you forget his eyes, the way he moves. What came first, the chicken or his coop, the promise or the pressure? I traced the pin grooves from his last note, his handwriting clumsy with age. The fox too is a right-hander, stepping out with a lot like a secret, feet of fire, disguised in a wooded land. But I have a hunch he's still out there, thriving and toothed and hidden like a fluid cursive writing on. Let's see, I think maybe I have time for one more. I'm sorry, Bill, I know you're holding up time cards, but I've got my nose in the book.
Go for one more.
Okay.
Yeah, we've got a question already lined up, so go ahead.
So this next one, while I was sort of diving through the words of this particular episode, I had a kind of childhood memory. And so this is childhood memory mixed or retold, and I guess therefore fictionalized through collage. And it's called Time for That Tetanus Booster. It's repurposed dialogue from season 2, episode 2. We used to test the water, dip our ankles in, gather eggs, grab at snakes, play in the field after, talking about monsters. Heavy rainfall made the sewers overflow into our waterway, raw, bizarre, discolored, not like real water, whatever the village flushed into the smelly underground catacombs. We called it Chernobyl and told lies about giant flukes who drew fools down there, made you eat bupkis and brush your teeth with sewage, scrub, 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 all with a smile. Think of the taste. This could be Jersey, the sea a radioactive soup, nature modeled by adults, the way the young warn one another, the shape of a life cycle. So thank you. I'll put a link in the chat if anyone's interested in learning more about the book.
Thank you very much. That was, I have a bunch of questions, but there was a question queued up from Billy Brown. So Billy, go ahead.
Hi, Amaris. Billy Brown, we've met before at a couple.
Hi, Billy.
I'm a poet as well. That was delightful. Not to denigrate the science behind the other presentations, but what a breath of fresh air. some creative language. So thank you for that. And also, I'd like you to be a featured poet at my monthly poetry reading sometime next year. I'll be in touch. Thank you.
Thanks. That was an easy question.
That wasn't a question.
So Mars, can you describe a little bit the first of all, sort of why you chose this approach, and secondly, sort of for those of us who don't do that kind of writing, like what is the creative process like? How do you identify how to proceed with a set of dialogue that you have in front of you?
Yeah, so a lot of this came out of the pandemic, where before in the evenings, I was a part of a couple different communities that could no longer meet because they're sport communities. And so probably like a lot of people, I found myself watching some TV and rewatching the X-Files in particular, which was always a favorite show of mine in the 90s. And I was really drawn in particular to the words that are used. They're often very specific. Several of them are grounded in the 1990s, but they're also grounded in Earth and in earthly problems and concerns. So unlike, say, somebody asked me, oh, would you do one about Star Trek? But Star Trek is so, many of the words are made up and specific to that show that you would need to understand what the show is in order to understand the words that are being used. So that's why I kind of was drawn to using the X-Files in particular. My process was usually to watch an episode and then to look up the transcript and start just taking words out of it that I liked, or maybe a phrase here or there that I found interesting for some reason, and then seeing if something in particular emerged. So one of the poems that I read, it started out, the episode was about a serial killer who's sending notes to Fox Mulder, and they do a handwriting analysis. And so I was very interested in this kind of handwriting language that they were using in the show. And so then that became the trigger for the poem. That's how the poet Richard Hugo would have described it, or the occasion for the poem. And then it's sort of, you kind of write away from that or with that topic in mind. But I did only use words that were spoken in the show. And so sometimes you get into like an awkward situation where you have to, it's like when you are learning a foreign language and you don't know the word, and so you have to talk around it in order to get there.
Great, thanks very much. Katya Crawford had a question. Katya, go ahead.
Hi, that was a great presentation, a great end to Wednesday Zoom meetings. The question that I have is really about if during this process, you answered part of it, if you were watching the X-Files and pausing and writing down phrases and words, and then like going back and sort of reshuffling them, but also when you read your poem now, has it divorced itself in a way from the X-Files, or is it this married relationship where this new narrative is coming out and the X-Files are still sort of present? Mm-hmm. Like I use the analogy a lot for my students when they're doing collage work, is it's sort of like hip hop, where you take you create a new language through this process of mixing and readapting a whole new sort of form. But is the X-Files still present for you?
I think that it depends on some of the poems. So some of the poems I think have definitely a life of their own, and some are more closely tied to the X-Files. So I didn't, like, for instance, I didn't read some of the Alien poems that I think have kind of a bigger sense of that greater narrative that happens in the television show. That said, I had a little test that I would do where I would read a poem to my husband, who had watched all the television shows with me, and see if he could guess the episode. And he failed like every time. so I think they stand alone in that respect as well.
Yeah, I was just wondering if you were getting, like, with each line, this little like glitch or snippet of an image from,
Well, and some of them I've rewatched, and then I've been like, oh, I recognize, like, now they're my words, right? I recognize my words in that sentence.
Thank you.
So to have a follow-up with that one, did you ever try to do a poem just on one character's, one of the main characters, just their language instead of just the whole episode?
That's a good question. I did not do that with any of them. And some of them I did try to give voice maybe to a character who didn't get to otherwise have much of a role, but steered away from the main characters themselves. So in the first poem that I read, there's a character, Mona, who is an archaeologist who works under a main archaeologist, and she's just sort of there to die. So I wanted to give her a little bit of room to talk about her concerns.
All right, well, thank you very much to all of our presenters. That one of the things I love about Lightning Lounge is the variety. Everything from hard science to poetry. It's really, I don't know, I find it really inspiring and joyful. So I really appreciate all of you presenting your hard work and creative work. So thanks for everybody for coming. Our next one is in February, on February 10th. If you're interested in participating and presenting, if you haven't done that before, just reach out to me or to Julia Fulgham or to Mary Jo or to Erin Haney, and any of us can get you in the queue to present during our spring sessions. So meanwhile, everybody stay